I remember the exact second my life split into before and after. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a screaming match in the rain. It was a Tuesday, 7:14 p.m., and I was standing in our kitchen in the house we'd bought 3 years ago, staring at the refrigerator door like it held the secrets to the universe. My husband, Mark, was in the living room, the low murmur of some sports highlight show filtering through the walls, a sound so familiar it had become white noise. I was cutting a lime for his gin and tonic, a ritual, a small act of service that I'd always found comforting. The knife was halfway through the rind when I saw it. It wasn't a big thing. It was the smallest, most insignificant detail you could imagine. A single, perfect, round smudge of what looked like strawberry jam right next to the handle of the fridge. It hadn't been there when I'd cleaned the kitchen that morning. Mark hated jam. He said it was for children and British people. We didn't even have jam in the house. I'd thrown out an old jar of blackberry preserves maybe 6 months ago because it had gotten that weird crystallized sugar crust on the top. So where the hell did this strawberry jam come from? I stood there, the knife frozen in my hand, and I just stared at it. My brain started doing this weird, frantic inventory. I thought about the day. Mark had been at work, a commercial real estate developer, always in meetings, always on his phone. I worked from home as a graphic designer, so I knew the routine. He'd left at 7:30 a.m., kissed my forehead, said he'd be late because he had a dinner with a client. I'd spent the day in my home office, the one with the window overlooking the backyard where the oak tree was dropping its first brown leaves of the season. I'd ordered a salad for lunch from that place on 4th Street. I'd taken a walk around the block. I'd FedExed a package. I'd done all the normal, mundane things that made up my safe, predictable suburban life. The jam smudge was a blemish on that safety. It was a tiny, pinkish-red question mark that my mind couldn't resolve. It was a logical impossibility. I put the knife down and wiped my hands on my jeans, slowly, deliberately. I walked over to the fridge and touched it. It was still slightly tacky, fresh. The kind of fresh that meant it had been made in the last hour or so. My heart started to tap out a strange, arrhythmic beat against my ribs. It was a ridiculous thing to get upset about. It was just a stain, a careless smear. I could have wiped it away and never thought about it again. But I couldn't, because it wasn't just a stain. It was a crack in the reality I'd been living in. It was the first thread that, if pulled, would unravel the entire tapestry of my marriage. I looked over at Mark. He was sprawled on the couch, one leg hooked over the armrest, his feet in those stupid wool socks I'd gotten him for Christmas. He had his reading glasses on, which he only wore at home, and his phone was in his hand, his thumb scrolling. He looked so normal, so Mark. The man who'd held my hair back when I had the flu last winter. The man who'd cried at our wedding when he saw me walking down the aisle. The man who, just last week, had talked about redoing the patio and finally getting that outdoor pizza oven he'd been coveting for 2 years. "How was your day?" I asked, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. It was higher, thinner. He didn't look up from his phone. Good. Long. That dinner with the Stevensons was a drag. Guy can't talk about anything but his golf handicap. He chuckled, a dry, perfunctory sound. "You get that package out?" "Yeah," I said. "Yeah, I did." I turned back to the fridge and opened the door, as if the answer to the smudge would be inside. There was the usual chaos. The organic milk, the leftover Thai food from Monday night, the jar of pickles, the carton of eggs. No jam. I closed the door, my fingers leaving a faint print on the stainless steel. I wiped the jam off with my thumb. It was a visceral sensation, the sticky, sweet smell of it against my skin. I washed my hands, the water too hot, and watched the red smear swirl down the drain. I went back to the counter and finished making his drink. I carried it to him, the glass sweating in my hand, the ice clinking. "Thanks, babe," he said, taking it without looking at me. He took a sip and set it on the coaster on the side table, a perfectly choreographed routine. He never once saw the storm in my eyes. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing beside me. He was on his back, one arm flung over his head, a picture of peaceful oblivion. My mind was a hamster on a wheel, running and getting nowhere. The jam. It had to be from someone. It had to be from this afternoon. Who had been in my house? I pictured the cleaning lady, Rosa, who came on Tuesdays. But she was a pro. She always used her own cleaning supplies, and she didn't eat here. She was like a ghost, leaving the place spotless. The mailman? The UPS guy who always had a kind word and a smile for me? None of them had come inside. I hadn't left the house unlocked. The only people with keys were me, Mark, and my sister, Claire, who lived 3 hours away. But the conclusion was so terrifying that my brain refused to compute it. It couldn't be Mark. It just couldn't. I knew him. I knew his patterns, his quirks, his secrets. He was an open book. He told me everything. We were one of those couples who had no secrets. We prided ourselves on it. We'd laugh at other couples who had hidden bank accounts or private text conversations. We were above that. We were the gold standard. We had the perfect, easy, effortless love. And yet, the next morning I was a zombie. I made coffee, the smell of it nauseating me. Mark was already dressed, a crisp blue shirt, perfectly tailored navy pants, his hair still damp from the shower. He was the picture of a successful, handsome American man. He kissed my cheek, a quick peck that barely grazed my skin. "You look tired," he said, his brow furrowing. "You okay?" "Fine," I lied. "Just didn't sleep great." "Yeah, me neither. That Thai food gave me indigestion." He grabbed his briefcase and his keys. "I'll be late again tonight. Big presentation tomorrow." He was gone before I could even formulate a response, the front door clicking shut behind him with a sound that felt like a judge's gavel. The house felt cavernous after he left. I wandered from room to room, touching things. His toothbrush in the holder, his phone charger on the nightstand, his half-finished book on the coffee table, a John Grisham thriller. Everything was in its place. Everything was exactly as it should be, and yet everything was wrong. I went into my home office, sat down at my desk, and booted up my computer. I opened my email, but I didn't read a single one. I opened the web browser and just stared at the blank search bar. I didn't even know what I was looking for. What do you search for when your life is perfect, but you think it might be a lie? A tutorial on how to get strawberry jam out of a refrigerator door? I was about to close the browser when I had a thought. A dark, intrusive, nauseating thought. It was the kind of thought that once it takes root, you can't unthink. I looked at the phone on my desk. Mark's old, dusty iPad was lying on the shelf next to it. He'd upgraded a couple of years ago and never bothered to wipe this one. It was essentially a paperweight, but it was still connected to our home Wi-Fi, and it was still connected to his iCloud. I knew his passcode. It was our anniversary. 0115. I'd always teased him that it was too obvious, too easy to guess. He just shrugged and said, "Who's going to steal my iPad?" My fingers were trembling as I picked it up. I felt like a thief in my own house. I felt like I was about to commit a crime against our trust, against our perfect marriage. A voice in my head was screaming at me to stop, to just put it down, to wipe that stupid jam off the fridge and forget the whole thing. But my hands were acting of their own accord. I typed in the 4 digits. The home screen glowed to life. It was the same photo of our dog, Cooper, that I had on my phone. It felt like a taunt. I found the Messages app. I opened it. The list of conversations was short and mundane. A group chat with his brothers, a few work colleagues, a text from his mom. Then I saw it. A thread with a name I didn't recognize. Stephanie. The preview just said, "I had the best time yesterday." My thumb was shaking violently now, a tremor that seemed to originate from the very core of my being. I tapped on the thread, and then I saw them. The messages, dozens of them, going back for months. My blood ran cold. It was a physical sensation, like ice water being pumped through my veins. It started in my chest and radiated outwards, down my arms, into my fingertips, up my neck. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't blink. I just stared at the screen, the words blurring and swimming in front of my eyes. They weren't just flirty. They weren't just suggestive. They were intimate. They were about their afternoons, about how he couldn't stop thinking about her, about the cute coffee shop on 5th where they'd met, about him telling her he wished he could see her every day. And there, in the middle of it all, was a message from yesterday. He'd sent her a picture, a selfie, taken in a room that I instantly recognized. It was our bedroom. He was smiling, a smile I knew and loved, but there was a glint in his eye that was for her. His message said, "Home sweet home. Wish you were here." I scrolled up, my eyes scouring the digital trail of my husband's betrayal. And then I found it, a message from Stephanie from yesterday afternoon. It was a photo, a picture of a beautifully arranged cheese board on a rustic wooden table, and next to it, a small bowl, a bowl of strawberry preserves. I didn't scream, I didn't throw the iPad against the wall, I didn't even cry. I just sat there in my ergonomic office chair, staring at that photo of the strawberry preserves, like it was a loaded gun aimed right between my eyes. My body went into some kind of survival mode, a strange, detached calm that felt more terrifying than any hysterical breakdown could have been. It was the calm of a person who has just been told they have a terminal illness. The shock is so total, so absolute, that your mind simply refuses to process it. It just shuts down the emotional centers and leaves you with this hollow, echoing silence where your heart used to be. I must have sat there for an hour, maybe 2. The sunlight shifted across my desk, creeping from the left side to the right, a silent testament to the time I was losing. I reread the messages over and over, like a detective poring over evidence, looking for some detail I might have missed, some loophole that would make it all a misunderstanding. Maybe it was a work thing. Maybe Stephanie was a client. Maybe the afternoons were business lunches, and the wish she were here was just friendly, harmless banter. But my brain, no matter how hard it tried, couldn't spin those texts into anything innocent. The language was too charged. The history was too long. The intimacy was too raw. The selfie he'd sent her from our bedroom was the knife that twisted the deepest. That was our room, our sanctuary, the place where we'd built a life together, where we'd made love and had whispered conversations at 2 a.m. and planned for a future that now felt like a cruel joke. He'd taken that picture while I was probably in the next room, working, making us dinner, folding his laundry. He'd looked into the camera, his eyes bright and eager, and he'd sent a piece of our home to another woman. He'd invited her into our most private space without my knowledge or consent. The violation was so profound, so intimate, that it made me feel physically sick. I could taste the bile rising in the back of my throat, acrid and hot. I finally stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me. I walked to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. I looked at myself in the mirror. My reflection was a stranger, a pale, hollow-eyed woman with a slack jaw and a look of utter devastation. I didn't recognize her. This wasn't the woman who'd gotten married 6 years ago, radiant and full of hope. This wasn't the woman who'd bought a house with her best friend and dreamed of filling it with children and laughter. This was someone else, someone broken. The rest of the day was a blur. I don't remember eating. I don't remember working. I just remember moving through the house like a ghost, my hand trailing along walls, my fingers touching Mark's things. I went into his closet and pressed my face into his shirts, inhaling his scent, the familiar mix of his cologne and laundry detergent. It was the smell of home. It was the smell of comfort. And now it was the smell of a lie. I found the receipt for a hotel downtown in his jacket pocket, the one he wore to work. It was from 3 weeks ago. The charge was for a single night. He told me he was out of town for a client meeting in a city 2 hours away. A detail so small, so easily missed, but now it screamed at me with the volume of a fire alarm. I wanted to call my sister, Claire. She was my person, my rock, the one who'd always known Mark was a little too charming, a little too smooth. She'd never said it outright, but I'd always seen the flicker of skepticism in her eyes. I could hear her voice in my head now, a gentle "I told you so," that would shatter me completely. I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't ready for anyone to know. Because if I told Claire, it would become real. It would be out in the world, and I wouldn't be able to stuff it back into the Pandora's box I just opened. Mark came home around 9. I was in the living room, sitting in the dark, the only light coming from the television I'd turned on but wasn't watching. I'd taken the iPad and hidden it in the back of my closet, buried under a pile of sweaters. I wasn't ready to confront him,
Not yet. I needed more. I needed to understand the scope of this thing. I needed to know who Stephanie was, what she looked like, how deep this rabbit hole went. "Hey, babe," he said, flicking on the hall light. He was loosening his tie, a gesture I'd always found endearing. Now it just looked like a performance. "Why are you sitting in the dark? You okay?" "Yeah," I said, my voice flat. "Just a headache." He came over and sat beside me on the couch. He put his hand on my knee, his palm warm and familiar. I flinched. It was a tiny movement, almost imperceptible, but I felt him notice. His hand hovered there for a second, then withdrew. "You want some Advil? I can get you some water." "No, I'm fine. I think I just need to sleep it off." I stood up, eager to get away from him, from his touch, from the performance of normalcy that was suffocating me. "I'm going to go to bed. Don't stay up too late." He frowned, a look of genuine concern on his face. It was almost worse, seeing that concern, because it meant he was a good actor, a really, really good actor. "Okay, sweetheart, I'll be in soon." I went to our bedroom and closed the door. I didn't lock it. I couldn't lock it without raising suspicion. I lay in bed, my back to the door, and listened to the sounds of him moving around the house, the clink of ice in a glass, the low murmur of the TV, the creak of the floorboards as he walked past the bedroom door. He didn't come in. He stayed in the living room for another hour, and I lay there, wide awake, counting the minutes, imagining him texting her in the other room, telling her about his boring wife with a headache. That night, when he finally came to bed, he didn't try to touch me. He just got under the covers, said "Good night, babe," and was asleep in minutes. I turned my head on the pillow to look at him. His face was relaxed, peaceful. He looked innocent. He looked like the man I'd fallen in love with. And in that moment, a terrible, cold resolve settled over me. I wasn't going to be the one to break. I wasn't going to be the hysterical wife. I was going to be smart. I was going to gather evidence. I was going to find out everything there was to know about this Stephanie. And then, when I had all the pieces, I would decide what to do. I would take back control of my life, because right now I felt like I was drowning, and the only thing keeping me afloat was the fury that was slowly starting to thaw the ice in my veins. The next day, I became a detective. I started with the easy stuff. I went through his computer while he was at work. I found the password for his email in a file on his desktop labeled passwords because he was an idiot who thought he was too clever to be caught. I scrolled through his sent folder, looking for any mention of her name. I found a few emails, but they were innocuous, surface level. It was the phone, the text messages, that held the real story. I knew I needed access to his phone, but he took it everywhere, even to the bathroom. It was his new appendage. I decided to go after Stephanie directly. I had her last name from the text thread. It was a common one, Miller. I spent hours on social media, scrolling through profiles of every Stephanie Miller in a 100-mile radius. I felt like a cyberstalker, a private investigator, someone I didn't recognize. I found her around 3 p.m. Her profile picture was a professionally taken headshot.
She was beautiful, not in a loud, flashy way, but in a serene, elegant way. Long, dark hair, high cheekbones, a smile that looked both warm and mischievous. She looked like the kind of woman who had her life together, who went to yoga classes and drank green smoothies, and probably had a career that didn't involve working from home in pajama pants. I clicked through her photos. She was a real estate agent. Of course she was. That's probably how they met. Mark was in commercial real estate. It wasn't a stretch to think their professional worlds collided. She was in a lot of photos with other agents, at networking events, at fancy restaurant openings. She looked successful. She looked happy. She looked like the kind of woman my husband would be drawn to. I found her Instagram next. It was public. She had a curated aesthetic of clean lines, neutral colors, and organic meals. Her profile was a shrine to a life of effortless sophistication. She posted about her morning runs, her latest listing, her artisanal cheese boards. And there, in her stories from yesterday, I saw it. A picture of a coffee shop, a very specific independent coffee shop on 5th Street, the same one Mark had mentioned in his messages to her. The caption said, "My favorite way to start a Tuesday." And there, in the corner of the frame, reflected in the glass window of the shop, was a partial silhouette of a man. I zoomed in, my heart hammering. It was a blur, just a shape, but I knew that shape. I knew the slope of his shoulders, the way he tilted his head. It was Mark. The proof was piling up. It was a mountain of evidence I couldn't ignore. And yet, I was still in denial. A part of me, a foolish, hopeful part, still wanted to believe it was all a misunderstanding. I told myself that maybe he was just a consultant, that the coffee shop meeting was business, that the intimate texts were just a flirtation, nothing more. I was making excuses for him, the way people do when they're terrified of the truth. I decided I needed to see them together. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I couldn't just rely on digital breadcrumbs. I needed the visceral, undeniable reality of it. So I started planning. I started watching him more closely, noting his patterns. He said he had a meeting on Friday afternoon. A meeting with a developer on the east side, he said. I pretended to buy it. I smiled and said I was going to meet a friend for dinner, so he shouldn't worry about coming home early. He kissed my forehead and left, and I felt a piece of my soul die. That Friday, I waited for an hour. Then I drove to his office. I parked across the street, a gray minivan that was as forgettable as I felt. I watched the entrance. I didn't have to wait long. Around 1:30 p.m., Mark emerged. He was holding the hand of the woman from the Instagram profile, Stephanie. She was laughing at something he'd said, her head tilted back, her hair cascading down her back. He was looking at her with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in years. It was pure, unadulterated adoration. It was the way he used to look at me. I watched them get into his car. I watched him open the door for her, a gentlemanly gesture that cut me to the quick. I watched him drive away, and I just sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. I didn't follow them. I didn't need to. I had seen enough. The truth was now burned into my retinas, a permanent scar I would carry for the rest of my life. Mark was having an affair, and the woman was beautiful, successful, and waiting for him to leave me. Everything he'd said, every I love you that had slipped from his lips, every promise he'd made, every dream we'd shared, it was all ash in my mouth. I went home and I sat on the floor of our closet, surrounded by his shoes, and I finally let myself break. The tears came, hot and violent, tearing out of my throat in ugly, gasping sobs. I didn't just cry for the loss of my marriage. I cried for the loss of myself. The woman I was before I knew the truth was gone. I had no idea who I was going to be when I crawled out of this hole. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My marriage was over. And I was going to make sure Mark and Stephanie felt the earth move beneath their feet before I let them walk off into the sunset together. I started thinking about the house. I started thinking about the bank accounts. I started thinking about all the things I'd sacrificed for us. I was a partner in this marriage, not a bystander, and it was time I stopped being the passive, trusting wife. It was time I fought back. My grief was slowly being replaced by a cold, calculating fury. It was a dangerous feeling, but it felt like the only thing I had left. I wiped my face, took a deep breath, and went to find my laptop. I had a meeting with a divorce attorney to schedule, and I had a lot of evidence to organize. The war had just begun. The days that followed were a masterclass in compartmentalization. I became two people. There was the woman who went through the motions of her life, who made coffee and smiled at Mark and asked about his day, who pretended that everything was fine while her insides were a churning, toxic mess. And then there was the other woman, the one who lived in the shadows, the one who was methodically dismantling her marriage piece by piece, gathering ammunition, building a fortress of evidence that would protect her when the inevitable collapse came. I found a divorce attorney through a recommendation from a college friend who'd been through a brutal custody battle. Her name was Patricia, and she was everything I needed her to be: sharp, efficient, and utterly devoid of sentimentality. Her office was on the 23rd floor of a glass tower downtown, all minimalist furniture and strategic silences. She didn't flinch when I told her about the texts, the photos, the coffee shop, the hotel receipt. She just nodded, took meticulous notes, and asked me one question that stopped me cold. "What do you want, Sarah?" I opened my mouth to say something about justice, about making him pay, about not letting him get away with it. But what came out was something far more raw, far more honest. I want to stop feeling like a ghost in my own life. I want to look in the mirror and recognize myself again. Patricia leaned back in her chair,
her eyes softening for just a fraction of a second. "Then we need to get you out of that house. Not because you're weak, but because staying there is making you sick. You can't heal in the place where you were broken." She was right. I knew she was right. But the thought of leaving, of walking away from the life I'd built, was paralyzing. That house wasn't just a structure. It was a repository of memories. The kitchen where we'd cooked our first Thanksgiving dinner together, the backyard where we talked about having kids, the bedroom where we'd made promises I now knew were hollow. Leaving it felt like admitting defeat, but staying felt like a slow, agonizing death. I started making a list, a practical, cold-blooded list of everything I needed to do to protect myself. I opened a separate bank account in my name only and started diverting a portion of my freelance income into it. I gathered copies of all our financial documents, tax returns, mortgage statements, investment portfolios. I downloaded every text message, every email, every photo that could serve as evidence. I documented everything, creating a digital dossier that would make a forensic accountant weep with envy. I was building a case, and with every piece of evidence I collected, I felt a little less like a victim and a little more like a warrior. But the hardest part wasn't the logistics. It was the mask I had to wear every single night. The pretense.
The performance of a marriage that was already dead. Mark was oblivious. That was the most infuriating part. He was so wrapped up in his affair, so convinced of his own cleverness, that he didn't notice the chill in my voice, the distance in my eyes, the way I pulled away from his touch. He'd come home, drop his briefcase by the door, and give me that easy, disarming smile that had once made my heart flutter. Now, it just made me want to scream. "How was your day?" he'd ask, pouring himself a glass of wine. "Fine," I'd say. "Yours?" Same old. Meetings, paperwork, you know the drill." I'd nod. My jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. Same old. Was that what he called his afternoons with Stephanie? Was that what he called the text he sent her while I was in the next room? The lies were so seamless, so effortless, that I started to wonder if he even knew where the truth ended and the fiction began. Did he feel guilty? Did he ever look at me and see the woman he'd vowed to love and cherish? Or was I just a piece of furniture, a comfortable fixture he'd grown tired of? One night, about a week after I'd seen them together, Mark came home with a bottle of champagne. He was practically glowing, his energy manic and bright. "We're celebrating," he announced, setting the bottle on the kitchen counter. "I closed the Stevenson deal. It's huge, Sarah, a game changer." I stared at the bottle. It was the same brand we'd had at our wedding. The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh. "That's great, Mark," I said, my voice flat. "Congratulations." "Come on, babe, don't be so subdued. This is big." He popped the cork and poured 2 glasses, handing one to me. He clinked his glass against mine, his eyes sparkling with that familiar, boyish enthusiasm. "To us," he said, "to everything we're building." I took a sip. The champagne tasted like battery acid. "To us," I echoed, the words tasting like ash. He didn't notice. He never noticed. He launched into a detailed account of his triumph, the negotiations, the handshake, the sheer magnitude of his success. And all I could think about was how he probably already told Stephanie the news. He'd probably texted her from the car, his fingers flying across the screen, sharing his victory with the woman who really mattered. I was just the audience, the prop, the wife who was supposed to smile and applaud and make him feel like the king of the world. That night, after he'd fallen asleep, I got up and went to the kitchen. I stood by the refrigerator, my hand resting on the handle, and I remembered the jam. It felt like a lifetime ago, that tiny, insignificant smudge, but it had been the crack in the dam, the first sign that the flood was coming. And now I was drowning. I started to imagine a different life, a life without Mark, a life where I wasn't constantly second-guessing myself, where I wasn't shrinking myself to fit into the narrow space he'd carved out for me. What would it feel like to wake up in a quiet apartment, to make coffee for one, to have no one to answer to? The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. It felt like staring into an abyss, but maybe, just maybe, the abyss was freedom. The next morning, I decided to take a more active role in my investigation. I knew I needed to see Stephanie again, not as a shadow in a parking lot, but as a person. I needed to look her in the eyes and see who this woman was, what she had that I didn't, why my husband had thrown away 6 years of marriage for her. It was a masochistic impulse, I knew that, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to understand. I needed to make sense of the senseless. I found out where she worked from her Instagram. It was a boutique real estate agency in a trendy part of town, the kind of place with exposed brick walls and succulents on every surface. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a tailored blazer and a pair of dark jeans, something that said I was professional but approachable. I drove over, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I walked in, my palms sweating, and told the receptionist I was interested in listing my home. "I'd love to work with Stephanie Miller," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. "I've heard wonderful things about her." The receptionist smiled and disappeared into the back. A few minutes later, Stephanie emerged. She was even more stunning in person, tall, graceful, with an aura of confidence that seemed to fill the room. Her smile was warm, her handshake firm. She had no idea who I was. She had no idea that I was the wife of the man she was sleeping with. She looked at me like I was just another potential client, another opportunity. "Hi, I'm Stephanie," she said, gesturing to a sleek conference room. "Come on in. Tell me about your property." I sat down across from her, my legs trembling beneath the table. I watched her as she talked, her gestures fluid, her voice melodic. She asked about my home, my timeline, my ideal price point. I answered her questions mechanically, my mind racing. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to tell her who I was, to watch the color drain from her face, to see her squirm under the weight of her betrayal. But I didn't. I held it together. I played my part. And then, at the end of the meeting, as she was walking me to the door, I did something that surprised even me. I turned to her and smiled. "You know," I said, "my husband, Mark, he works in commercial real estate. You might know him. Mark Donovan?" Her face flickered. It was just a split second, a tiny crack in her perfect composure, but I saw it. The color rose slightly in her cheeks. She recovered quickly, her smile back in place. "Mark Donovan? The name sounds familiar. I think we might have crossed paths at a networking event." "Probably," I said, my voice light. "Small world, isn't it?" She nodded, and I could see the wheels turning in her head. The unease was there, just beneath the surface. I had planted a seed, a tiny grain of doubt, and I knew it would grow. I knew she would call Mark later that night, her voice tinged with panic, and I knew he would scramble to reassure her, to explain that his boring, clueless wife had just been a coincidence. I drove home with a strange sense of satisfaction. I hadn't exposed them. Not yet. But I had rattled their cage. I had reminded them that I existed, that I was a real person with a real presence in this world, not just a convenient fiction they could ignore. It was a small victory, but in the war I was waging, I would take any victory I could get. That night, Mark was more distant than usual. He barely spoke to me at dinner, his eyes glued to his phone. I didn't ask who he was texting. I already knew. He was talking to Stephanie, reassuring her, smoothing over the rough edges I'd created. And I sat there, eating my pasta, feeling a cold, dark satisfaction bloom in my chest. Let them worry. Let them squirm. They had no idea what was coming. They had no idea how deep my anger ran. I was no longer the woman who cried in the closet. I was the woman who was going to burn it all down. The reckoning came on a Sunday afternoon. It was the kind of perfect autumn day that made you forget every bad thing that had ever happened. Crisp air, golden light, the smell of wood smoke drifting from a neighbor's chimney. I was in the kitchen, making a pot of chili, the one recipe Mark always begged me to make when the weather turned cold. It was a small act of domesticity, a ritual that had once felt like love. Now it felt like a weapon. I was chopping onions, the tears streaming down my face, when I heard his car pull into the driveway. He'd been gone all morning. A client breakfast, he'd said. I knew better. I'd seen the texts he'd sent Stephanie the night before, the ones I'd read while he was in the shower, his phone left carelessly on the nightstand. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow," he'd written. "I'll make an excuse to get out early." I'd stood there, his phone in my trembling hands, and I'd felt something inside me snap. The last fragile thread of hope, the one that had been whispering that maybe, just maybe, I could fix this, that we could go to therapy, that we could find our way back to each other. It broke.
and in its place, a cold, clear fury took root. I heard the front door open. I heard him call my name, his voice bright and casual. I heard his footsteps on the hardwood floor, the familiar creak of the third board from the left. And I knew in that moment that I was done pretending. I was done smiling and nodding and playing the role of the clueless wife. The performance was over. He walked into the kitchen, his cheeks flushed from the cold, his hair slightly windswept. He looked happy. He looked like a man who had just spent the morning with the woman he loved. He was still wearing the same sweater he'd had on when he left, a navy cashmere one I'd given him for his birthday. It felt like a betrayal all on its own. "Hey, babe," he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. I turned my head, and his lips brushed my ear instead. He pulled back, frowning. "You okay?" I set down the knife. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, and I turned to face him, my heart pounding, my voice steady. "Where were you, Mark?" He blinked. "I told you, client breakfast, with the Stevensons. Stop." I held up my hand. "Just stop. Don't lie to me. Not anymore." His face went pale. It was a subtle shift, the color draining from his cheeks, the slight tightening around his eyes. He knew. In that instant, he knew I knew. But he was a gambler, and he'd played this game before. He tried to bluff. "What are you talking about, Sarah? I don't understand." "You don't understand?"
I laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "You don't understand how I found out about Stephanie?" I watched his face crumble, watched the mask of confusion fall away, replaced by something raw and ugly. Fear. "You think I don't know about the coffee shop on 5th? About the hotel downtown? About the messages you sent her while I'm sleeping in the next room?" He opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time in our 6 years of marriage, Mark Donovan was speechless. He stood there, his hands hanging limply at his sides, looking like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming truck. And I felt a surge of power so intoxicating it almost made me dizzy. "I know everything," I continued, my voice low and even. "I know about the jam on the fridge, the one you thought I wouldn't notice. I know about the selfie you took in our bedroom, the one you sent her while I was folding your laundry. I know about the meetings that weren't meetings, the nights you came home late with lies on your lips. I know about all of it, Mark, and I've been watching you. I've been waiting. I've been giving you chance after chance to come clean, to tell me the truth. But you never did. You just kept lying, kept sneaking around, kept treating me like I was some kind of fool." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Sarah, I can explain." "There's nothing to explain," I said, cutting him off. "I don't want to hear your excuses. I don't want to hear how it's my fault, how I was too busy with work, how I didn't pay you enough attention. I don't want to hear any of it, because none of it matters. You made a choice. Every single day, you made a choice to lie to me, to betray me, to throw away everything we built. And now, you have to live with the consequences." His face crumbled. For a moment, I saw a flicker of the man I'd married, the man who'd held my hand at my mother's funeral, the man who'd whispered that he'd love me forever. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by desperation. He stepped toward me, his hands outstretched. "Please, Sarah, please just let me talk. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you." "Don't," I said, my voice cracking for the first time. "Don't you dare touch me." He froze, his hands hovering in the air. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I could see the gears turning in his head, the frantic calculations of a man who had just been cornered. And I knew, in that moment, that he wasn't sorry for the affair. He was sorry he got caught. "Is it over?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. It was a moment of weakness, a tiny crack in my armor. I hated myself for asking. I hated that I still cared, still hoped. But the words were out there, hanging in the air between us. He hesitated. It was just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. I saw the truth in his eyes. It wasn't over. He wasn't going to end it. He was going to make promises he couldn't keep, tell me what I wanted to hear, and then go right back to her the second I turned my back. And in that moment, any lingering shred of love I had for him evaporated. "I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice pleading. "I'll do anything. I'll end it. I'll go to therapy. No,"
I said, shaking my head. No, you won't. You'll say whatever you think I want to hear, and then you'll find a way to see her again. Because that's who you are now. That's who you've become. And I'm done being the one who waits at home, the one who makes your dinner and folds your clothes and pretends not to see the lies in your eyes. I walked over to the drawer by the sink. I pulled out a manila envelope I'd prepared earlier. It was thick, heavy with the weight of all the evidence I'd collected. I dropped it on the counter between us. This is everything. Texts, photos, hotel receipts, credit card statements, everything you ever sent her, everything you ever did.
I have copies, multiple copies, and I've already met with a divorce attorney. His face went white. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life, I said. I want you out of this house by the end of the week, and I want you to know that I'm going to take you for everything I can. Not because I need the money, because I want you to feel what it's like to lose something you thought was yours. He started to protest, to argue, to plead, but I wasn't listening. I walked out of the kitchen, out of the house, into the cold autumn air. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't be in that house, in that room, with that man for one more second. I ended up at a park a few miles away. I sat on the bench, watching families play with their kids, couples walk hand in hand, and I felt utterly alone. The tears came, finally, hot and relentless. I cried for the future I'd lost, for the children I'd never have, for the woman I used to be. I cried until my eyes were raw and my throat was sore. And then, when there was nothing left, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. It was a tiny, fragile thing, barely a whisper, but it was there, the first sign that I was going to survive this. I stayed at my sister Claire's house that night. She didn't ask questions. She just wrapped me in a hug and let me cry on her shoulder. She made me tea and put on a movie I didn't watch and told me I was brave. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. The next few days were a blur of logistics. Mark moved out, just as I'd asked. He tried to fight it, tried to talk me out of it, but I stood my ground. I didn't have to see him. I communicated through Patricia, my attorney. It was cleaner that way, less emotional. And I realized with a strange sense of detachment that I didn't miss him. I missed the idea of him, the person I thought he was. But that person was a fiction, a character he'd played.
The real Mark was a stranger, and I didn't owe him anything. Stephanie reached out to me. It was the middle of the night, a text from an unknown number. "I'm so sorry," it read. "I didn't know he was married. Please, I never wanted to hurt you." I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. I was tempted to call her a liar, to tell her exactly what I thought of her and her excuses, but I didn't. I just deleted the message and blocked her number. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about me, my healing, my future, my peace. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. It was quick, brutal, and clinical. I got the house, I got a fair settlement, and I got something even more valuable, my freedom. The day the papers were signed, I walked into the empty house, and I just stood in the middle of the living room. The sun was streaming through the windows, casting everything in a warm golden light. I looked around at the space that had once held so much hope and joy, and I felt a strange sense of closure. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning. I started seeing a therapist. I started running, something I'd always hated but found strangely therapeutic. I started painting again, the thing I'd given up when I'd gotten married because Mark thought it was messy and impractical. I was learning to be alone, to be happy in my own company, to find joy in the small, quiet moments of my life. It wasn't easy. There were nights I woke up in a cold sweat, convinced I could still hear his voice in the other room. There were days I felt like I was drowning, but slowly, painfully, I started to put myself back together. One evening, about a year after the divorce, I was at a gallery opening for a local artist. I was there with Claire, sipping a glass of wine, pretending to care about abstract paintings. And then I saw him, Mark. He was standing across the room, his arm around a woman I didn't recognize.
She was pretty, younger, laughing at something he'd said. He looked happy, carefree, like he'd already moved on. And I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a quiet, peaceful emptiness. He was a ghost from a past life, a lesson I'd learned and left behind. He saw me. I saw him see me. He hesitated, his face a mixture of surprise and guilt. And I just smiled, a small, genuine smile. I turned away, and I didn't look back, because I had finally understood the one thing that had been hidden in plain sight all along. The truth wasn't about the jam on the fridge or the messages on the phone. The truth was that I had lost myself somewhere along the way, and finding myself again was the real victory. Mark's betrayal had been a gift in disguise, a push out of a comfortable, suffocating cocoon. And now I was flying.